The aliens mocked humanity's old tech arsenal. Then the Railguns answered. Voth arrived on a Tuesday. Not that they cared about Tuesdays, they cared about gravitational windows, orbital alignments, and the precise moment Earth's magnetic field dipped low enough to slip their scout vessels through without triggering what they called a resonance bleed. We learned this later, during the debriefs, when their linguists had finally wrestled our syntax into something resembling communication. At the time, what we knew was this: 17 triangular ships, each roughly the size of a destroyer, materialized over the Pacific Basin at 0347 UTC, and they broadcast on every radio frequency simultaneously in a tone that sounded, according to the SETI team scrambled from Mountain View, like someone dragging a cello bow across a metal pipe. The message took 11 days to partially decode. The summary, as rendered by the joint UN-NASA Translation Committee: *, we have observed your world for some time. We come to assess your readiness for broader contact. Please do not attempt aggressive action. Your capability to harm us is negligible. *. That last sentence was the one that stuck. Negligible. The word was apparently a direct cognate. Their language had an equivalent concept, and the translator confirmed it was the closest match. Not limited. Not inferior. Negligible. As in, beneath serious consideration. Admiral Cressida Park, commanding the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier group which had repositioned to 200 nautical miles beneath the nearest Voth vessel, read the translation in her flag briefing room at 0600 and said nothing for a long moment. Then she asked her intelligence officer, Commander Yusuf Adeyemi, to read it back to her again. Negligible, she repeated when he finished. That's the translation, Admiral. She folded the paper, an actual paper printout, one of her habits, and set it on the table with the careful precision of someone choosing not to crumple it. Get me a full inventory of every weapons platform currently within engagement range of those vessels. Everything. Old, new, experimental. I want to know what we have. What they had was, by the Voth's apparent estimation, not much. The Voth ships had spent 3 weeks in a holding pattern above the Pacific before they made their first formal approach, descending to roughly 40,000 feet above the Midway Atoll and transmitting a request, more accurately, a notification, that their diplomatic representatives wished to address representatives of Earth's primary administrative bodies. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session. The diplomatic contacts were arranged. And while all of that was happening, while the cameras and the press and the terrified and the exhilarated public were all watching the Voth vessels hang in the sky like chrome ornaments, military analysts on 6 continents were running the same calculations. The Voth ships had demonstrated, casually and without apparent concern, a propulsion system that violated 3 assumptions in standard aerospace engineering. They had brushed off an experimental high-powered microwave test, one that a U.S. Air Force spokesman carefully did not confirm or deny, without the slightest deviation in course. Their hull materials registered on radar in a way that suggested either metamaterial construction or something that had no analog in human materials science. They radiated almost no heat. They communicated faster than any signal propagation we could measure. And they carried weapons. Not prominently displayed, but visible in the high-resolution imaging pulled from reconnaissance satellites. Recessed emitter arrays along their ventral hulls, angular protrusions that matched no aircraft or naval architecture in any database, and what appeared to be a projector system of some kind mounted at the bow of each ship. One analyst at the National Reconnaissance Office wrote in his assessment, *, if these are weapons, they are generations ahead of anything we can field. If they are not weapons, I cannot determine their purpose. *. So when the Voth diplomatic envoy, a tall, gray-skinned bilateral being with 4 fingers and a posture that conveyed, even across species lines, a kind of polite condescension, sat across from the Secretary-General at a table in Geneva and said, through the translation matrix, "We understand you possess kinetic launch systems and explosive munitions. We wish to note that these technologies are, from our perspective, pre-emergent. You should not consider them relevant to this conversation." The room understood exactly what was being implied. You have rocks. We have starships. This is a formality. The Secretary-General, a Finnish woman named Ira Mäkinen who had spent 3 decades in conflict resolution, smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who had heard condescension in 40 languages and learned never to show that it had landed. She thanked the envoy for their candor. She said Earth looked forward to productive dialogue. In the hallway afterward, she pulled aside the UN's senior military liaison, a retired British general named Marcus Ford, and said quietly, "Get me honest assessments. Not diplomatic ones. I want to know what our people actually think we can do." General Ford spent the next 72 hours on encrypted calls with chiefs of defense across NATO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and a dozen independent military establishments. He asked each of them the same question: if this goes wrong, what do we actually have? The answers were not uniformly grim. They were not uniformly confident. But they shared a consistent undercurrent, a cautious, professional assessment that the public and the press were not hearing, and that the VOTH apparently had not considered worth investigating. Nobody was calling our weapons negligible from inside a targeting room. VOTH had done their reconnaissance carefully. 17 years of observation, as they later disclosed, 17 years of monitoring our radio transmissions, our satellite telemetry, our broadcast media. They had cataloged our weapons systems with what they considered thorough diligence. They had identified nuclear warheads, ballistic missiles, chemical and biological programs, conventional explosive ordnance, and directed energy research. They had cross-referenced these against their own historical records of emerging civilizations and concluded that humanity was, in their taxonomy, a Stage 3 kinetic culture, meaning we had mastered the application of force through mass and velocity but had not yet discovered the field manipulation technologies that defined what they called maturity. What they had not read, because we had not broadcast it, was the classified research. Not all of it was secret for reasons of military advantage. Some of it was secret because it was embarrassing: programs that had burned through budgets and delivered questionable results, prototype systems that worked intermittently or only under laboratory conditions, technologies that existed in the gap between proof of concept and deployable weapon. The U.S. Navy's electromagnetic railgun program, for instance, had been officially suspended and quietly unfunded in public budget documents. The press had covered its cancellation. Defense journalists had written postmortems. The official record showed a shelved program. The official record was incomplete. Commander Yusuf Adeyemi had been, before his current intelligence posting, an acquisition officer in the Naval Sea Systems Command. He had watched the public railgun program wind down with the particular frustration of someone who knew what the classified continuation looked like. The public program had been cancelled because it had problems: power supply issues, barrel degradation, hypervelocity projectile guidance in terminal phase. These were real problems. They were also problems that had, in the years since the public cancellation, been substantially addressed in a facility in the Nevada desert that did not appear on any open-source map. There were other programs. Not all American. The Russians had continued work on their own electromagnetic launch research through a defense institute in Novosibirsk that officially studied atmospheric physics. The Chinese had 3 separate programs at different classification levels, 2 of which were coordinated with naval research at Sanya. The French Direction Générale de l'Armement had a materials science program that had produced a projectile casing that could survive a railgun launch without structural compromise, a problem that had killed more than one competing program. The Israelis had taken a different approach entirely, focusing not on the launch system but on guidance. A package small enough to fit in a 40mm sabot that could withstand 50,000 Gs of acceleration and still steer. None of this had been broadcast. None of it appeared in the signals intelligence the VOTH had collected. It existed in vaulted servers and classified annexes and the memories of people who had signed agreements they still took seriously. Adeyemi compiled his inventory in a classified annex to Admiral Park's briefing package and titled it, with the flat directness of a man who did not go in for flourish, Assessment of Non-Public Capability Relevant to Current Situation. The document was 12 pages long. Admiral Park read it twice. Then she called her weapons officer, Captain De Yong Kwan, into her office, closed the door and said, "Tell me about realistic effective range against a hull like what we're looking at." Kwan was a careful man. He was not given to optimism or pessimism, he was given to calculations. He sat down across from her, opened a tablet, and for 40 minutes walked her through engagement geometry, projectile energy retention over distance, terminal velocity against estimated hull resistance, and the compounding variables that made any such estimate more art than science. When he finished, she asked, "So what's the honest answer?" He looked at his tablet for a moment. Then he looked at her. "The honest answer is that nobody has ever shot one of those things. We don't know what their hull can take. We don't know if our guidance packages can track through whatever they do to local electromagnetic fields. We don't know if they have point defense we haven't observed yet." He paused. "But the physics doesn't care who built the target. That's a real projectile traveling at a real velocity with a real amount of energy. If it hits, it hits." Admiral Park nodded slowly. "And if we had to do it without them knowing we were ready to try?" Quan looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent his career preparing for a question exactly like this one and had never expected to be asked it. We'd need to stop letting them think they already know everything we have. This, it turned out, was exactly the conclusion that General Ford had been reaching simultaneously in Geneva. The Voth had formed their assessment early and had not updated it. They believed they understood humanity's military capability because they had observed humanity's military capability, the part humanity had allowed to be visible. The gap between that observation and the classified reality was not a secret that could be maintained forever. But it was a secret that could be maintained long enough to matter, if something went wrong. Something went wrong on day 49 of the contact. It began with a disagreement about territorial rights to the asteroid belt. Voth had not come to conquer Earth. This was the assessment of every intelligence service with analysts working the contact, and the assessment held through the first 7 weeks. Their interest was primarily economic. The solar system's asteroid belt represented, in their resource taxonomy, a Class II mineral deposit, meaning it was worth exploiting but not worth going to war over from scratch. They wanted preferential extraction rights. They wanted a formal acknowledgement that humanity would not contest their operations in the belt. And they wanted, though they couched it in careful diplomatic language, a kind of permanent junior status for Earth in whatever regional governance structure they were plugged into. The Secretary-General's negotiating team, led by a Brazilian trade lawyer named Paulo Salavier who had spent his career dismantling unfair extraction contracts in international arbitration, recognized the structure immediately. It was a concession agreement. It looked like diplomacy, but it was a concession agreement, the kind that left the conceding party technically sovereign and practically dependent. Salavier had been in rooms like this before, with different faces and different languages, and he had learned that the people on the other side of these agreements always had the same tell. They did not consider the possibility that the other party might walk away. They assumed the power differential was so obvious that the weaker party had already internalized it, already accepted the conclusion, and was simply negotiating the aesthetic details of their own subordination. The Voth envoy, whose name translated phonetically to something resembling Ethar, had this tell. Not arrogantly, not cruelly, just with the quiet certainty of a being who had done this many times before and knew how it went. On day 49, in a session that had been grinding through technical language for 6 hours, Ethar's delegation tabled a revised clause that would have effectively barred human spacecraft from a zone extending 40 million kilometers from the asteroid belt's inner edge for a period of 200 years. Salavier read the clause, reread it, and looked up at Ethar with an expression his staff knew well, the one he used when a counterparty had just revealed that they were not negotiating in good faith. This zone encompasses Mars, Salavier said. Mars is currently uninhabited by your species, Ethar replied through the translation matrix. We fail to see the material objection. The material objection, Salavier said carefully, is that this clause would prohibit human expansion for 2 centuries. We are not prepared to agree to that. Ethar was quiet for a moment, or rather, the translation matrix was quiet while whatever the Voth used for communication processed. Then, we had understood this to be within the range of acceptable terms. Perhaps we have miscalculated your flexibility. Perhaps, Salavier said. The session broke. Both sides retreated to their respective quarters. The Voth team to a pressurized habitat module they had landed on the outskirts of Geneva, the human delegation to a secure floor of the Palais des Nations. And within that secure floor, a video conference began at 2100 local time that included Secretary-General Mackinnon, General Ford, 3 heads of state and Admiral Park, patched in from the Ford Carrier Group on a heavily encrypted channel. The conversation was frank in the way that conversations become when the people in them have stopped managing their language for an audience. They've moved the goalposts past the point we agreed was unacceptable, Salavier said. This isn't a negotiating position anymore. This is a test. They're seeing how far we'll go. What's the read on their intent if we refuse? One of the heads of state asked. General Ford leaned forward. The assessment is that they won't initiate force over a failed negotiation. Their calculus is economic. War is expensive. But, he paused. There's a secondary assessment that says if we refuse and they decide we're going to be a persistent obstacle, they have options short of open conflict that could be very damaging. Resource denial. Technological leverage with other regional powers. Long-game pressure. So we're looking at a slow squeeze if we say no, Secretary-General Mackinnon said. Not a question. Possibly. She was quiet for a moment. The video feed showed her looking at something off-camera, the same paper-folding habit she had, Ford suspected, pressing the corner of a document between her fingers. What changes if they believe we can hurt them? The question wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. It landed in the silence and sat there. Admiral Park spoke from the encrypted channel, her voice carrying the slight compression artifact of a heavily secured signal. With respect, Secretary General, that's the question we should have been building an answer to since day one. Not because we want to fight, but because the entire shape of this negotiation changes if they revise their assessment of us. Pause. Right now they're negotiating with a species they consider unarmed. That's a very different conversation than the one they'd be having if they thought we could make them bleed. You're talking about revealing capability, Fort said. I'm talking about demonstrating it, Park said. There's a difference. Revealing means telling them. Demonstrating means showing them. One of those options they can discount. The other one they have to sit with. The call went on for another 2 hours. It ended without a decision, which was itself a kind of decision. A collective agreement to keep the option on the table, to not close the door, to let Admiral Park's people keep running the calculations while Salavier went back to the table and bought time. What nobody said aloud, but everyone understood. They were preparing for the possibility that the Voth's certainty about humanity's negligible capability would need to be corrected. Not with a declaration. Not with a press release. With a demonstration. Reinstallations had been running parallel programs under different budget lines, different oversight structures and different cover stories. The decision to consolidate them, to pull the threads together into a single coordinated capability under military command authority, took a week of conference calls, one secure in-person meeting at a facility in the Colorado Rockies, and a presidential finding that classified itself. The first installation was in the Nevada desert, as Adeyemi had known. It was called, in its budget documentation, a high-energy physics research station, which was accurate in the same way that describing a scalpel as a sharpened metal instrument was accurate. The station housed 3 generations of electromagnetic launch development: the abandoned Mark I design, the partially resolved Mark II with its improved power conditioning system, and the Mark III, the one that had never appeared in any public document, that had been developed in the gap between the official cancellation and the present, that had been fed by a materials science program in France and a guidance package from Israel and a barrel metallurgy solution from a defense contractor in South Korea whose public portfolio consisted entirely of civilian infrastructure products. The Mark III could accelerate a 23-kilogram tungsten composite penetrator to Mach 7.2 at the muzzle. It could sustain 6 rounds per minute before thermal limits required a cooling cycle. Its guidance package, the Israeli system miniaturized to survive the launch environment, could maintain lock on a target through electromagnetic interference that would have blinded any previous seeker head. The barrel was rated for 200 operational rounds before replacement. It was not, by any measure, the most elegant weapon humanity had ever built. It was large, power-hungry, and logistically demanding. But it was real, it worked, and it existed in a quantity that had surprised even General Ford when the consolidated inventory came back. 14 operational Mark III platforms. 8 mobile, mounted on heavily modified ground vehicles. 6 fixed, including 2 installed on naval vessels that the Voth's reconnaissance had identified as conventionally armed destroyers. The second installation was in the Qinghai Tibet Plateau, inside a research facility that officially studied atmospheric ionization. The Chinese program had taken a different design philosophy. They had prioritized rate of fire over individual projectile energy, producing a system that could put 30 rounds downrange in 90 seconds with each round carrying roughly half the kinetic energy of the American design. Different approach, different trade-off, same physics. A real projectile with a real velocity hitting a real target. The third was the one that had surprised the American analysts when the consolidated picture emerged. A joint development between the European Defense Agency and a private consortium that had been running through a Luxembourg holding company, producing not a railgun in the traditional sense but what its engineers called a repetitive kinetic impactor. It was, essentially, a very fast automatic weapon using electromagnetic acceleration instead of chemical propellants. Lower individual round energy, but a sustained rate of fire that could put 200 rounds on a target in 30 seconds, each one traveling at Mach 4.8. None of these systems had been designed specifically for the Voth. They had been designed for the full range of contingencies that defense planners worry about, which is to say they had been designed for everything and nothing in particular. But they had been designed and built and tested, and the fact that they had not been designed for the Voth did not change what they could do to a target. Captain De Yong Quan, working through the engagement analysis with a small team of physicists and weapons engineers who had been quietly relocated to the Ford's intelligence spaces, ran the numbers repeatedly. The core uncertainty was the Voth hull. They had good imaging, good spectroscopic analysis from the sensors the Voth had allowed near their ships during the initial contact period, and a reasonable materials science inference about what they were looking at. A metamaterial lattice structure, probably. It had the radar return of something with designed electromagnetic properties. Engineered, not found. Built for specific purposes. The question was whether it was built for kinetic impact. Electromagnetic field manipulation was useful against a wide range of weapons. It was not, in the fundamental physics, a defense against a dense projectile traveling at high velocity. The hull could be armored. Could be very well armored. But 23 kilograms of tungsten at Mach 7 represented a specific number of joules of kinetic energy, and those joules did not negotiate. There are two scenarios, Quan told Admiral Park. First scenario, their hull is passively strong enough to absorb or deflect a hit. In that case we're looking at surface damage at best, no penetration. Second scenario, their hull is optimized for field effect threats and is not specifically hardened for kinetic impact, in which case the energy transfer is going to do what energy transfer does. How do we find out which scenario we're in without firing first? We don't, Quan said. Not with certainty. But there's an indirect inference. He pulled up a spectroscopic analysis on his tablet. Their hulls are dense in some frequency ranges and transparent in others. That pattern is consistent with engineered electromagnetic shielding. It's not consistent with the kind of homogeneous mass distribution you'd want if you were primarily worried about kinetic threats. You'd build differently for a bullet than for an EMP. Park studied the display. They built for the threats they expected. That's the inference. They expected field effect weapons because that's what mature civilizations use. They didn't expect Mach 7 tungsten because from their perspective that's a pre-emergent technology. Why armor against something you don't consider a threat? There it was. The gap between what the Voth had assessed and what existed. Not a secret that humanity had been hoarding, simply a capability that the Voth had categorized as beneath consideration and therefore not modeled in their threat assessment. The same evening that Quan briefed Admiral Park, Salavier sent a formal communication to the Voth delegation. The human negotiating team was not in a position to accept the revised territorial clause, and requested that the Voth delegation reconsider its terms within a 72-hour window. Ethar's response came in 4 hours. It was not a reconsideration. It was, in the careful language of the translation matrix, a restatement. The terms were as presented. We note that your species history suggests a preference for conflict over accommodation. We wish to observe that this preference has typically served your species poorly when the power differential is as pronounced as it is here. We encourage you to reconsider your position. Mackinnon read the response and thought for a long moment. Then she authorized General Ford to begin coordinating a demonstration. Not a threat. Not a declaration. A demonstration. Demonstration was planned for 72 hours after the authorization, not because the military needed that long to prepare but because Salavier needed that long to exhaust every remaining diplomatic avenue. He spent those 3 days in the most brutal negotiating sessions of his career, pushing every variant of the 200-year territorial clause, proposing alternatives, offering concessions in other areas, trying to find any version of a compromise that the Voth would accept without the hard restriction on human expansion. He was not optimistic, but he was thorough. When he finally walked out of the session on the morning of the third day and sent the secure message to Geneva that said only no agreement, he had the particular exhaustion of a man who had left nothing on the table. The demonstration had been designed around a principle that Admiral Park had articulated in the planning session. It needed to be unambiguous, it needed to be non-lethal, and it needed to be something the Voth could not attribute to an accident or a malfunction or a misunderstanding. They chose one of the Voth's support vessels, a smaller craft that had remained in low Earth orbit while the diplomatic ships descended. It was, by the best intelligence available, an unmanned logistics platform, roughly equivalent in function to a supply drone. It had been in a stable orbit at 380 kilometers altitude for the entire duration of the contact, apparently automated, broadcasting nothing, doing nothing interesting. The Voth had not specifically identified it as protected. They had not specifically identified any of their vessels as protected, because from their perspective the question had not seemed relevant. 3 days before the deadline, the USS Lake Erie, ostensibly a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, publicly known as a capable but aging platform, privately host to one of the 6 fixed Mark III installations, repositioned to a firing solution under the cover of a routine exercise notice. The repositioning was observed by the Voth's orbital sensors almost certainly. A ship moving to a different position was not, in itself, alarming. Ships moved. The target was a maintenance boom extending from the aft section of the logistics platform, a structural element extending roughly 40 meters from the main hull, used apparently for some kind of servicing function, currently retracted but visible in the imaging as a distinct structural protrusion. The firing solution was calculated to strike the boom at its midpoint, which modeling suggested would shear it cleanly without transmitting sufficient force to the main hull to damage the primary systems. It was, as Quan put it in the briefing, the least violent way to make a point we have available. At 0437 UTC on the morning of the 52nd day of contact, the Lake Erie fired. The technical performance of the shot was, in the dispassionate language of the after-action report, nominal. The power system performed within design parameters. The projectile launched cleanly. The guidance package acquired the target at 200 kilometers and maintained lock through the terminal phase despite the electromagnetic signature of the Voth vessel's systems, which produced a pattern the seeker had not been trained on but was able to work around. Time of flight to target was 38 seconds. Impact velocity was Mach 6.7 after atmospheric drag. The boom was struck at the projected point and severed completely, tumbling away from the main hull in a slow spin that was visible from the ground with a telescope. The Voth logistics platform's main hull was undamaged, precisely as intended. The Voth response was not immediate. There were 22 minutes of silence across all communication channels. Not a communications blackout, the signals were still present, just carrying nothing. Then Ethar's delegation requested an emergency session. Not requested. Demanded. The translation matrix rendered the word with a priority flag it had not previously used. The session was held within the hour. Ethar arrived without the measured composure that had characterized every previous interaction. This was not anger. Nothing in Voth body language that the xenolinguistics team could identify mapped cleanly to anger. It was something else. Recalibration, someone suggested later. The specific psychological state of a being whose fundamental model of a situation has been revised without warning. You have struck one of our vessels, Ethar said. We struck a non-critical structural element of an unmanned support platform, Salavier replied. Deliberately, precisely, and without causing damage to your primary systems. We wanted you to see that we could. Pause. The translation matrix ran. The projectile you employed. It was not consistent with the capabilities we had assessed. No, Salavier said. It wasn't. Another pause longer. There are more such systems. It was not a question, but Salavier answered it anyway. Yes. The silence in the room had a specific texture. Not the silence of emptiness but the silence of a calculation running. Ethar's delegation exchanged something among themselves. A rapid series of vocalizations too fast and complex for the translation matrix to process in real time, rendered in the transcript later as internal consultation, duration 4 minutes, content partially recovered. What the xenolinguistics team recovered from the partial transcript, pieced together over the following days, was not a strategic discussion. It was something closer to a foundational reassessment. The Voth had built their entire approach to the contact on a threat model. The threat model had been wrong. Not slightly wrong, wrong in a category-defining way. They had assessed humanity as a Stage 3 kinetic culture and had based their negotiating position, their confidence, their certainty about the power differential, on that assessment. The assessment had been incomplete. And a culture that had the capability to strike a target at 380 kilometers altitude with sufficient precision to sever a specific structural element and leave the primary hull untouched was not a culture that could be safely categorized as negligible. Ethar looked at Salavier for a long moment. We will require a recess to consult with our principals. Of course, Salavier said. The recess lasted 18 hours. Voth communication system worked on principles that were, at the time of the contact, not fully understood by human scientists. The physical component, a device installed in their diplomatic habitat, had been detected and roughly characterized by the signals intelligence teams monitoring the contact site, but its actual mechanism remained opaque. What was understood? It was faster than radio, it used some form of field coherence rather than electromagnetic radiation, and it was, in the Voth's apparent assessment, completely secure from human interception. It was not completely secure from human interception. Not because humanity had cracked the physics, they hadn't. But because the device, when active, produced a thermal signature, a gravitational gradient anomaly, small, but detectable with the right seismographic array at the right distance, and a measurable effect on local atomic clocks. None of these individually carried information. Together, filtered through an analysis pipeline that had been running for 30 years in a program that officially studied anomalous atmospheric effects, they produced a timing pattern that a team of cryptomathematicians could work with. They couldn't read the content of what Ethar transmitted, but they could infer structure, the length of the communication, the presence of what appeared to be a response, and something about the pattern that suggested, to the analysts who had spent decades looking at communication metadata, a kind of urgency that had not been present in previous transmissions. What Ethar actually reported, as pieced together from the partial intercepts and later from the formal Voth disclosure that came much later, during the period historians would call the normalization, a complete reassessment of human capability. Not a diplomatic summary, a technical report. The kind of report that a field officer files when the intelligence picture has fundamentally changed. The key revision was not, as it might seem, simply about the railgun. The railgun was the evidence. The revision was about what the railgun implied. A civilization that had developed electromagnetic launch capability and kept it classified was a civilization that understood strategic deception. A civilization that understood strategic deception had been, for the entire duration of the contact, actively concealing its actual capability while presenting a false picture of helplessness. Which meant that the helplessness, the entire effect of an emerging species humbled by the arrival of a superior technology, had been, at least in part, calculated. This was not, in the Voth's experience, something Stage 3 cultures did. Stage 3 cultures knew what they knew and showed what they had because they hadn't yet learned that there was a game being played above the level of simple force demonstration. They hadn't learned that the most dangerous technology a civilization could possess, before it had starships and field weapons, was the understanding that information was a weapon, that apparent weakness could be deployed as strategically as any missile, that a species willing to appear helpless while concealing its real capability was a species that was thinking several moves ahead. Ethar's report described this at length. It used a Voth concept that translated, approximately, as depth, the quality of a civilization that presented one face while harboring another. Depth was associated, in Voth historical records, with civilizations that had been underestimated and had leveraged that underestimation. Civilizations with depth were not, the records showed, easy to manage. They were not easy to contain. They had a way of turning the assumptions of more powerful neighbors against those neighbors, using the gap between perceived and actual capability as a fulcrum. The response from Voth principles, whatever the equivalent of a command authority resided back in their home system, took 11 hours to arrive. The full content was never recovered. What the analysts inferred from the timing pattern, it was long and there was a significant pause before the response, which suggested consultation at a level above the contact team's normal chain of command. What changed in Ethar's behavior after the response was received was subtle but consistent. The measured condescension was gone, not replaced by fear, nothing that dramatic. Replaced by something that the xenolinguistics team characterized as professional recalibration. The body language of someone who had updated their model and was now proceeding on the updated model rather than the old one. When the formal session resumed, Ethar's delegation arrived without two of the technical advisors who had been present at every previous meeting. They brought instead a diplomatic specialist who had not been part of the original team, who was introduced with a title that translated as something like contract architect, a seniority designation that implied this was now being treated as a serious negotiation between parties whose relative capabilities needed to be genuinely accounted for, rather than a process formality preceding an inevitable outcome. Salavier noticed. He didn't comment on it. He simply sat down across from the contract architect and said, as if the previous 7 weeks had been a preamble, "Shall we discuss the terms?" "We shall," the contract architect said. "And then, we wish to note that we may have made certain assumptions in our initial approach that require correction." It was, in its way, a remarkable sentence. Salavier had been in 1,000 negotiations and he knew what it cost to say something like that. He knew that the power it took to revise an assumption publicly in a negotiating room was not small. He respected it. "We all have that experience sometimes," he said, and let it go. The new terms took 3 days to negotiate. They did not include a 200-year territorial restriction. They included a 15-year collaborative framework for belt development with jointly defined zones and revenue-sharing provisions. They included a technology exchange protocol that was, on first reading, remarkably balanced, the kind of balance that implied the Voth's principles had instructed the contract architect to come back with something defensible, something that would hold over the long term, something that treated the humans as what they had apparently turned out to be, a negotiating party worth taking seriously. Back in her flag briefing room, Admiral Park read the preliminary terms and said nothing for a while. Then she said to Commander Adeyemi, "They updated their model." "They did," he said. She nodded slowly. "Good. That's what we needed." She didn't say, "And now they know we're not done updating ours." The final agreement was signed on the 91st day of contact. The ceremony was broadcast globally, carried on every major network, translated into 47 languages. The Secretary General and the VOTH contract architect signed first. Then the technical annexes were signed by secondary delegations. The translation matrix was used throughout, and the ceremony lasted 3 hours, and there was a moment near the end, captured by cameras and played endlessly in the weeks afterward, when Ethar, standing in the back of the room as an observer rather than a participant, looked at the proceedings with an expression that the xenolinguistics team spent months analyzing and ultimately declined to characterize definitively. Some called it respect. Some called it reassessment. One analyst, in a paper that became more widely cited than she had expected, called it the specific expression of a being encountering a species it had misclassified. Not underestimated. Misclassified. There was a difference. Underestimation implied that the VOTH had looked at humanity and applied the right framework and simply gotten the numbers wrong. Misclassification meant something deeper. They had applied the wrong framework entirely. They had looked at humanity and seen a stage 3 kinetic culture, primitive, predictable, destined for a particular trajectory, and they had been wrong not because our weapons were more powerful than they thought, but because we were not the kind of civilization their framework was built to analyze. The railgun was not the point. The railgun was the evidence of the point. Commander Adeyemi wrote about this in a memoir published 15 years later, after the classified programs had been largely declassified in the post-contact transparency accords. He spent a chapter on what he called the gap, the space between what the VOTH had observed and what existed, the space that a generation of scientists and engineers and defense planners had built in the dark, not for the VOTH specifically, not for any specific enemy, but because the work was worth doing and because the people doing it understood something fundamental. You do not show all your cards at the beginning of a game you don't yet understand the rules of. He was careful to note that the railgun program had not been a deception aimed at the VOTH. It had existed before the VOTH arrived. It would have existed if the VOTH had never arrived. The secrecy was not a strategy against them, it was simply a feature of how human defense development worked, a feature that happened, in this instance, to matter enormously. What interested him more, in retrospect, was the psychological dimension. The VOTH had arrived confident. Their confidence was not arrogance in the pejorative sense, it was a rational conclusion drawn from observed evidence. They had looked at humanity's visible military capability and made a reasonable inference. They were wrong because the evidence they had access to was incomplete, and they were wrong because they had not sufficiently weighted the possibility that the evidence was incomplete. This was, Adeyemi wrote, an intelligence failure. Not a moral failure. Not a strategic failure, exactly. An intelligence failure, the failure to account for the limits of your own picture. Every intelligence service in the world understood this failure mode. They had spent decades building doctrines and processes to guard against it. Red teams, alternative analysis, structured analytic techniques designed to force analysts to ask, what if we're wrong? The VOTH apparently did not have these doctrines. Or had them and had not applied them to a civilization they considered pre-emergent. They would have them now. That was the other thing that changed. The technology exchange protocols that came out of the 91-day contact were real. They were not the asymmetric transfer that the original VOTH proposal had implied. They were genuine exchanges, conducted over the following decade with a rigor and a mutual investment that surprised both sides. Humanity gave the VOTH something they had not expected to receive. Several solutions to engineering problems that VOTH science had been working on for decades. The specific problems are classified even now, but the broad category is known. They were problems in materials science, in certain aspects of field coherent stability, and in a manufacturing technique that the VOTH had approached from a theoretical direction without finding a practical resolution. Humanity had found the practical resolution, messily and empirically, through exactly the kind of brute force experimental iteration that the VOTH's more theoretical approach had skipped over. The VOTH gave humanity its first non-theoretical framework for understanding field effect propulsion. That technology took 30 years to turn into anything flyable. But it turned into something flyable. General Ford died before the first human field drive vessel launched. He had retired 2 years after the contact, received his honors, written a short memoir that carefully declined to describe anything classified, and lived quietly in Edinburgh until he was 84. At his funeral, the Secretary General sent a message that was read aloud by his daughter. It said, in part, **, he understood that strength is not only what you can do, It is what others believe you cannot do, kept in reserve, kept ready, used only when the moment requires it, and then used with such precision that the lesson is unmistakable. Asterisk. Admiral Park was at the launch of the first field drive vessel, standing on the observation deck of the facility in Nevada that had once been called a high-energy physics research station and was now called the Cressida Park Center for Advanced Propulsion. She was 79 years old and she stood without assistance and she watched the vessel rise on a column of light that had no exhaust and made almost no sound, and she did not cry, which was consistent with everything those who knew her had come to expect. Commander Adeyemi was there too, older, retired, standing beside her. He watched the ship climb until it became a point of light indistinguishable from the stars behind it, and then he said quietly, "Negligible." Park turned to look at him. "That's what they called us," he said. "Negligible." She looked back up at the sky where the ship had been. "Yes," she said. "They did." A long pause. "They learned better," she said. And that was all. The ship was gone. The sky was clear. Somewhere out past the orbit of Mars, in the collaborative extraction zones defined by a treaty that had been signed in Geneva on the 91st day of contact, Voth and human mining operations ran side by side in a relationship that was not yet friendship but was no longer condescension. Something more durable than either, built on the specific foundation of mutual surprise. The Voth had arrived believing they understood us. The Railguns had answered that belief with evidence. And what came after the evidence? The adjustment, the recalibration, the slow construction of something real between two species that had both, in the end, turned out to be more complicated than first appearances. That was the story the cameras hadn't caught. That was the story that mattered.